It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radios in your future. This segment, an interesting one indeed. President Obama recently went and has now returned from Cuba, and we're going to be talking to a gentleman that is well-versed on that subject. His name is James Early. He's been to Cuba more than 50 times himself. He's the former director of Cultural Heritage Policy at the Smithsonian Institute's Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. We are happy to have him here. James Early, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing fine on this nice springish day in Washington, D.C.
Indeed. Well, let's do this. Let's give our Lewis at Large listeners a little bit more background. You are the Director of Cultural Heritage at the Smithsonian Institution Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Tell us a little bit about your career and why the subject of Cuba in particular is so, why you're so passionate about it.
Well, I've worked in culture all of my life at Howard University, at the Institute of the Black World in Atlanta, Georgia, at the National Endowment for the Humanities, and at the Smithsonian. And, of course, as a 1960s person, Cuba captured the imagination of many young people about our utopian dreams of justice and development. And secondly, being an African American, when many in my generation were studying African languages and going to Africa to reconnect with their heritage, I, being a Spanish speaker as an African American, was very interested in the African diaspora. And Cuba is one of the renowned places in this hemisphere where many African cultures inform the overall national culture of Cuba. In fact, the largest religion in Cuba is not Catholicism. Cuba was never particularly Catholic by way of comparison, let's say, to Brazil or Argentina or Mexico. Cuba is renowned for which are still very active in civil society and in worship there, and mixes with Catholicism as well. So that's the context of my personal and professional interest in Cuba, of doing research on Cuban culture in general, but working on issues of cultural policy. As Cuba is renowned for its educational system, with its students scoring as high as students in the developed world, in some instances higher on math and science, it is a very cultured country with one of the world's three leading ballet schools after the Russians and the British. It's the Cuban ballet that is most renowned. And so the cultural policies that led to focus on education, free health, and those disciplines, and the young people who have come through that educational system and who have become renowned on the global stage, is all a part of the context of my personal interest as well as my professional work during my 31 years at the Smithsonian, although I started working around Cuba long before then.
What, when you would see over the last several years Cuban refugees on a wooden raft trying to make it to the United States, what kind of feelings did that instill in you?
Oh, it is a feeling of sadness, of sorrow, a sense of economic desperation, not unlike the Great Migration from the southern part of the United States during the heyday of violence against Black Americans and the Great Migrations out of the South to the North. Not unlike the characteristic migrations from all around the world, where we see people fleeing and dying outside of the Channel in London, stacked up by the thousands as they leave these underdeveloped countries which were ravished by colonialism, and they are moving towards the economic engines of the North. That is why we have so many Mexican and other immigrants from Central America and Mexico coming because of the economic engine here, and Cuba being although it is the largest republic in the Caribbean of 11 million people, when you put it on a global scale of 7 billion people on the planet, they are distinguished in their socialist ideology and their political economy, which has failed, but they are not distinguished from other human beings who are looking for a better lifestyle. So it is a tragic and sad situation. Abetted in large measure, and this is one of the policy debates that continues to go on between the United States government and the Cuban government, abetted by the Cuban Adjustment Act that says if a Cuban reaches these shores and puts their foot on dry land, they are fully accepted into the country. That is not the case with any other immigrant group, be it from Latin America or Europe or other places. So again, this is a context, but yes, it is a disturbing, sad sight to see people in desperation who risk drowning, whether it's in Europe, all of the Africans dying trying to get to Europe, or the Syrians dying trying to get to Europe, or the Cubans, or the Mexicans, or the Central Americans who are coming through Mexico to try to get in the United States.
You know, President Obama's trip to Cuba, the first one in several decades there, obviously curious as to your feelings about that. What are the opportunities that you see there, and what are some of the challenges?
It's the first trip of a U.S. president in 88 years to Cuba, and it is a historic moment both for the American people and the American government, and for the Cuban people and the Cuban government. Cuba has been under a U.S. blockade or embargo. Those terms are not quite interchangeable. For 50 years, with its crops being poisoned, its farm animals being poisoned, planes being bombed, tourists and hotels being bombed, Fidel Castro under various assassination attempts as admitted by the CIA. So that it is a testament, no matter what one thinks of Cuban's ideology or its economy, that the people have persevered and built their country as best they could and achieved as best they could. But it's also an accomplishment on the part of the U.S. public, recalling that President Barack Obama, on both of his runs for the president, said that he would get rid of this embargo and a rapprochement towards Cuba. And so it is the fulfillment of the aspirations of millions of voters in the United States across, again, the ideological and political spectrum for different reasons. It's also a great moment for our hemisphere in general, as the United States has stood outside of the pale of the protocols of nations, the community of Latin American and Caribbean nations, which includes all Latin American and Caribbean nations, except Canada and the United States, although 97% of those countries have very close bilateral ties with both Canada and the United States, have insisted, as has the European Union, which arrived in Cuba the week before President Obama, that there be this rapprochement. So we are re-entering the protocols of nations by which nations pursue mutual interest as well as debate and struggle over their differences. The practical implications of that is that now you can send letters to Cuba. Cuban Americans, under President Barack Obama's executive order, have freer travel. They're able to send more remittances to Cuba. The downside of that is Cuba, by way of the embargo, is not able to export its goods here. And some of those goods are services, I should say, are critically important for us here in the United States. Cuba is one of the leading biotechnical countries in the world. It has at least 3 anti-cancer vaccines. And so that we would benefit here in that country. They have an educational system, again, in which their students score very high in math and science according to all of the international assessments of their children. Mrs. Obama met with Cuban students to talk about the pedagogy that leads to their educational achievement. So it is, again, a benefit on both sides. I think we should be cautious, however, is that Cuba is interested in a normal relationship, not in a sole relationship with the United States. And one reflection of that is that over the last decade or so, Cuba has brought up to about $700 million of food from the United States, which it was allowed to do, but although it had to put money on the table before it received its goods, that has been reduced over the last 3 years, even as the banking relationships are now being more flexible, allowing Cubans credit. So, again, this is a context, I think, for U.S. citizens to actively think about, engage, and make assessments about this new relationship.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're in the middle of a conversation about Cuba, past, present, and future with James Early. He is well-traveled to that country, having been there more than 50 times. He's a former director of the Cultural Heritage Policy at the Smithsonian Institution Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. James, what about as you look and you ponder the thawing of relationships between these two countries? Do you see Cuba, some would say cynically maybe, Cuba ends up simply being an extension of the United States in many ways, that suddenly there'll be American hotels, American stores, American casinos, American this, that, and the other thing. A, do you agree with that? And B, if you do, is it necessarily a bad thing, or is there some positive there?
I'm doubtful if that will happen, but for some long historical reasons. Cuba is a very nationalistic country from the time of its defeat of Spanish colonialism. And one part of Cuba's, a deep part of its ethos, I guess I would say, is that their virtues and their warts are their virtues and their warts, and they want to deal with that, and they don't want to become dependent on anyone, particularly the United States, which controlled two-thirds of the Cuban economy on the eve of the Cuban Revolution, controlled the sugar production, tourism, prostitution was rampant, gambling was rampant. We know from the iconic movies here in the United States of the great mafia meetings there, Meyer Lansky and Santos Giannaccani and others who controlled Cuba. So I don't think a new generation, certainly the old generation, will not permit it. And I don't think a newer generation, whether they be socialist, communist, or simply nationalists, are going to allow that to happen. They will, however, the government is, however, moving in the interest of the Cuban people to judiciously deal with U.S. investments, including hotels. Starwood hotel chain has a contract to renovate the iconic Inglaterra Hotel, which is the oldest hotel in Havana, a really marvelous hotel that sits right next to the Opera House. The Opera House sits right next to the National Capitol building, which is a replica of the U.S. Capitol. So we will see a judicious, a selective engagement around U.S. businesses, particularly those that can help the state continue to control education and health. But for the smaller entrepreneurs, we will see some relationships there, but I think there will be an attempt to prevent monopoly and surplus. Already they're feeling and seeing the differential based on race in Cuba, because remittances coming into the country, as well as the cultural orientation of many U.S. visitors, is to deal with people who look like us, who we think act like us. And so the issues of racism in this hemisphere, Cuba is not free of that either, as neither are we. So again, this will be, I think, a context to be assessed as Cubans go forward in this rapprochement with regard to investment and what they think is of interest to their society.
What about the dynamic of the reuniting of separated families over the decades? That surely will be something that would be occurring, I would think, at a fairly rapid rate.
Well, it has been occurring now for a considerable time under the executive orders, particularly of President Obama. And so Cuban Americans are much freer now to go back and forth to Cuba, to increase the amount of remittances that they send to Cuba. Certainly, this new stage of the establishment of diplomatic relations will elevate those numbers. We'll see many more Cubans going. When I'm traveling through Miami, for example, there are always long lines of Cuban Americans waiting to get on the charter planes with huge bags carrying various kinds of materials, from toys to car parts to television sets. We will see that continue on an individual level, but I think we will also see that occur on a business level. For example, there is a company in Alabama that has made a small, easily repairable tractor that fits the terrain and the needs of Cuban farmers. And so we will see businesses like that There are many businesses on the Mississippi River who grow rice or poultry who want to export foodstuffs to Cuba. There's a lot of competition between various ports in the United States, Mobile and Tampa, who want to be key sites, key interlocutors on commercial issues. And Cuban Americans will be a major part of that, both as everyday citizens as well as Cuban American big-time entrepreneurs with others. You may be aware that the head of the Chamber of Commerce of the United States went down about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, to the dismay of some in the ideological political arena. But one of the first things that the United States government has done is to provide an office for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So I think big things are to selectively will be evolving, and certainly Cuban Americans will be a key part of that.
What about, let's look at the United States elections. Go out to November, pick a candidate. Tell us how relations with Cuba might, with these things, accelerate or deaccelerate depending on who wins office, and tell us between the candidates, pick any that you choose, and tell us how our relations with Cuba might be affected by the election of those people.
Well, in general, I do not think that this relationship of the establishment of diplomatic relationships will be changed. However, I think depending on who is the next president of the United States, the pace and the tension with which that moves forward, I think will probably slow down considerably, except if it were Bernie Sanders. In my view, I think it would probably continue much the pace along the lines of President Barack Obama. I think if it were Hillary Clinton, there will be a slower pace and more sluggish, and perhaps a lot more struggle going on. If it is a Republican candidate, whether it's Cruz or Donald Trump, I think there will be a lot of bluster. But I think the economic imperatives, the investment interest in the United States, would push it forward. And if it's from Ohio, I think it would be closer probably to somewhere between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders in the way that would unfold. So I think for the moment it's a fait accompli over the next long number of years, perhaps decades, that this establishment of diplomatic relationship will hold, which is different than normalization of relations. I think normalization of relations will move apace, but I think rather sluggishly. And finally, I think there will be a push within the U.S. Congress for very practical economic reasons to drop this blockade, because U.S. investors really are at the end of the line and not able to compete with other large investors throughout this hemisphere and from around the world. As I said, the European Union was there the week before President Barack Obama and established its rapprochement. Brazil has put, although Brazil's economy is in bad shape right now, has put large amounts of money into the development of a deep water port in Mariel. The Russians are there, the Malaysians are there, the Chinese are there, the Indians are there. And so I think U.S. business is saying, hey, we want to be able to compete, and we need to get out of the end of the line, so we need this blockade dropped.
Do you see, and maybe it's a little bit of an assumption, and maybe it's not proper, but do you see the quality of life, the I guess maybe just the standard of living necessarily slowly over time, but steadily over time, raising in Cuba as a result of some of this normalization, or is that something that's not necessarily in the cards?
Indeed, I do see this, and I would venture to say that based on my 40 years of traveling to Cuba and close conversations both with Cuban citizens and members of the Cuban government, including members of the Cuban Communist Party, that they have wanted this rapprochement, particularly with regard to the positive things that could accrue to their failed economy. The Cubans have had to face the fact that the irony of having one of the world's most educated populations, again, by the investigation of the United Nations and other international bodies who do these kinds of assessments, but not producing very much. Some of that has to do with that it is not a resource-rich country. Nickel is its major natural resource. The monocrop of sugar has not borne out in the late 20th and early 21st century. Its hard currency is basically from tourism, so more tourists are already going there from the U.S., competing with the large groups coming out of Canada and Spain and other places in Latin America, and the Chinese are now going there. There's a direct flight to Russia going there. So yes, this will help their economy. And there is much criticism going on within Cuba among Cuban citizens, among the Communist Party, among members of the government. I think people should be aware that in 2008, when Raul Castro was elected by the National Assembly to become president, notwithstanding the fact that he was a choice of his brother, who had run the country since the revolution began, one of the very first things he said was there was not enough criticism in Cuba, that people needed to be more critical, to speak out about what they thought worked, what does not work, why, if they had recommendations, to say so. And he was very hard on the Communist Party, that the Communist Party is not the government and the government is not the people. So that there is an emergent discourse going on in Cuba about a participatory democracy that says we have these very well-educated citizens who have been restricted from using their imagination and their creativity and their production skills. We've got to recalibrate how this goes on between the party, the state, the government, and the citizens without relinquishing their socialist revolution. Many young adult Cubans, while they uphold the ideals of the '59 revolution, are also very critical, along with some of the adults, about over-centralism, the lack of diversity in the media, the poor technology. And so this debate precedes President Obama going there, and certainly the external factor of the power and the attraction and the great admiration by Cuban citizens for the United States will certainly have a positive impact on how they look at their own strengths and weaknesses, and it will also allow contributions from this country.
Well, it is a subject that one that the world and certainly Americans will be looking forward to and analyzing. Some have been very critical of this move, but others are welcoming it as something that is long overdue. I certainly appreciate the opinions of and observations of James Early, again, former Director of Cultural Heritage at the Smithsonian Institution Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, talking about Cuba. Appreciate your observations here. How can our listeners find out more on the subject and maybe some of the writings that you've done?
Well, you can go online and just put James Early in, or James Counts Early in Cuba, and all kinds of things will show up. I should say that I'm the former director. I retired from the Smithsonian after 31 years last March. But I urge people not to just read me, others, but go to Cuba. Go online, look for trips to Cuba. There are religious Christian trips to Cuba. There are Jewish trips to Cuba. There's a small Jewish community in Cuba. There are cultural trips. There are dance trips. There are opera trips. There are jazz trips. Great music and dance and art in that country. Go and take a look for yourself and engage and come to your own opinions. That is what a true democracy is about. The demos, ordinary people, Quasha, the power of ordinary people. It's about a citizen-to-citizen engagement. Whatever your ideology or politics are, I would urge you to do that. I appreciate your going and looking at my stuff, but use your own assessments to determine how and why and if we should continue to engage with you.
Got it. Well, listen, again, thank you so much. I would love to have you on again.
Thank you. Take care.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large. Well, welcome, everybody, to another edition of Lewis at Large. You're truly Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and, of course, that means some smart talk radios in your future in this segment. No exception, talking about a subject we have touched on a little bit in the past, that subject being diabetes. And none other, our guest today is Tami A. Ross. She is a registered dietitian, certified diabetes educator and nationally recognized speaker, consultant, and health and nutrition writer from Lexington, Kentucky. She's the past president of the American Association of Diabetes Educators and was honored as Diabetes Educator of the Year in 2008 by the Diabetes Care and Educational Dietetic Practice Group. Brand new work called What Do I Eat Now? And it is a step-by-step guide to eating right with type 2 diabetes. Tami, how are you, my friend?
I am doing great. Good to be with you today, and I look forward to talking to you and your listeners over the next few minutes about diabetes, a topic near and dear to my heart for sure.
Well, let's do talk about that. This thing called diabetes that we didn't talk about much 20 years ago, but now it feels almost like an epidemic in the country.
It does. 29 million Americans, a little over 29 million, are touched by diabetes. And so chances are probably most everybody listening knows someone or, has come in contact with someone who's living with diabetes. So the purpose of this book, What Do I Eat Now, is really a step-by-step guide to help people get started and know how to eat healthy with diabetes. That's often the first question I'll get is, what do I eat now that I have diabetes? So look forward to talking about it and sharing some tips with your listeners.
It may seem obvious, but in your opinion, Tami, because you've been around this and worked with diabetes for so long, what are the reasons for the growth of this disease and condition, and why have we seen it coming? We just didn't do anything about it, or tell us about that.
Yeah, so with diabetes, these days we're hearing more and more and more about pre-diabetes, and basically what that means, I tell my patients, if you are told by your healthcare provider that you have pre-diabetes, that means your blood sugars are rising. They're higher than they should be, but not high enough yet to be called diabetes. And so as we think about diabetes and the pre-diabetes, for folks that may catch it in the pre-diabetes phase, what we know is that losing a little bit of weight, being more physically active can actually help halt or delay the transition to type 2 diabetes. So once type 2 diabetes appears, we still are focused on losing a little bit of weight if you're overweight, being more physically active, taking a look at what you're eating, and we can talk a little bit more about that as we go along today.
Tami, is there any at all relationship with diabetes and gender at all?
Interesting question. I don't know that I've seen any statistics related to that recently in my own patient population. I see both men and women that are touched by the disease, and we're seeing it more and more in children as well. We used to think of type 2 diabetes as an adult disease, and actually now the incidence in children is on the rise. But in terms of gender, I'll have to look into that. I don't know of any statistics offhand.
Is the simple answer for the rise of diabetes in children, is it diet, or are there factors other than that, do you think, that are contributing to what many people do feel is an alarming rate of diabetes in young people?
Yeah, so a couple things to consider. Type 2 diabetes is a genetic. It has a genetic link, hereditary, passed down through families. And what we know is that when people have that genetic predisposition, so to speak, for type 2 diabetes, that family history, that as you put on extra pounds, so, you were asking specifically about children, as children become sedentary, playing their video games, screen time, as they pick up extra weight, that can bring forth the type 2 diabetes. So it's the genetic link and then that lifestyle factor as well.
What, again, as you work with people, is it very obvious that someone is headed towards a diabetic state, so to speak, or does it take a lot of people by surprise?
It's interesting. A lot of people that I see in my own personal practice, I work in a primary care practice, they're surprised by the diagnosis. We hear a lot about the classic symptoms of diabetes. You may be more thirsty than usual, going to the bathroom more frequently, losing weight, just generally feeling fatigued, not feeling well. We think about those classic symptoms, but in talking to my own provider, about half of the cases that they see now in the practice, people don't know they have diabetes. So there are the classic symptoms, but it may catch people by surprise as well, particularly with type 2 diabetes in adults. What I hear frequently is people would just say, I'm just tired. I don't have the energy I used to have. I'm more tired than usual. And then when they have their blood work run, to find out if you have diabetes, it's a simple blood test. And they find out, hey, my blood sugars are elevated. And what the provider typically will look at is their fasting blood sugar or blood glucose. You'll hear it called both. And then also a blood test called A1C. And so that is a blood test that actually looks back over the last 2 to 3 months and can give the doctor or the provider a clear idea of what your blood sugars have been running on average over the past few months. So that's what they're looking for. And a lot of people are taken by surprise with that news.
Tami, is it true that once you sort of cross over, so to speak, and become a diabetic, you're always a diabetic, or is it possible that the disease goes into some state of remission or goes away, ultimately with a proper diet? Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question and one that I get quite frequently from folks. With type 2 diabetes, when you develop type 2 diabetes, it's pretty much there to stay. Now, kind of the caveat to that, I might say, is we're hearing more and more these days about people that are significantly overweight and may undergo bariatric surgery. And what we see in that patient population is that type 2 diabetes can go into, I'll say, kind of a remission. It may appear not to be there. Now, with that said, if people regain weight, it will typically reappear. So for the general adult population, once you're diagnosed with type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes for that matter, it's there to stay. Now, we can manage it, and that's the encouraging word that I want listeners to hear, is that it can be managed, and blood glucose levels can return to a normal level, but the diabetes is there underlying. So let's say you started eating healthier, lost weight, became more physically active, the glucose blood sugar went back into the normal range. If you gain that weight back or went back to, your old eating habits, the blood sugars would pop right back up. So it's there underlying, but it can be managed and you can live a healthy, long life. So.
Well, if you just joined us again, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, and right in the middle of an interesting segment with Tami A. Ross. She is a registered dietitian as well as a nationally recognized speaker, consultant, and expert on the subject of diabetes. She's the past president of the American Association of Diabetes Educators and was honored as Diabetes Educator of the Year 2008. Brand new work called What Do I Eat Now? Actually, it's the second edition. I wanted to ask you about that. In the second edition, what kind of updates do you have from the first one?
Oh, that's a good question. Anybody that's in the publishing world knows that generally a second edition has at least 25% new content. But actually, this book has, I would say, closer to 60 to 70% new content because so many things have evolved, over the last few years. And with this book, what your listeners will find in there is they'll find recipes, a multitude of practical, doable tips to help manage blood sugars with diabetes, and lots of good. When my patients look at it, they say it's just practical tips that have really helped me a lot. There's meal ideas in there. What do you eat for dinner, or what do you eat for breakfast, or what do you eat for snacks? You'll find actually menus in there that are carbohydrate controlled. And when we talk about diabetes and eating, carbohydrate, or some people will say carbs, are the big focus, looking at trying to get some consistency in the amount that people eat meal to meal, day to day, to help steady out the blood sugars. And so that really is what this focus is around. How do we bring carbohydrate control and do this in a manner where I can still enjoy life and still enjoy my favorite foods and navigate the many challenges that come our way? So there's a lot of new content in here to answer your question.
One of the challenges I'm sure that people feel when they're trying to eat healthy, diabetic or not, is the perception that eating fresh fruits, fresh vegetables sort of starts from scratch, and it's a real time and effort, sort of pain in the wazoo, so to speak, to keep up that kind of a diet versus the convenience of processed food, fast foods. Tell us a little bit about overcoming those challenges.
Yeah, in today's world, that definitely can be a challenge. Kind of an easy way that I think about it, that I explain healthy eating to my patients. You don't have to spend endless hours in the kitchen. But when you sit down and look at your plate, what you want to think about is that half of the plate would be covered with vegetables that are not starchy. That doesn't mean you have to cook everything from scratch. One of my favorite things is I'll buy a bag of the pre-washed like kale salad, and it comes with a light vinaigrette dressing, and so literally in 2 minutes I can fill half of my plate with a vegetable that way. You want to think about meat, a piece of meat about the size of the palm of your hand, and that's going to cover about a fourth of the plate. So again, it doesn't mean that you have to grill everything on a grill outside, but what that can mean is you might buy a chicken breast that you can stick in your oven, or if it is summer and you're grilling outside, some of my patients' favorite things are to put pork tenderloin on the grill, and then you can have that a couple of different days. But thinking about a lean meat portion the size of the palm of your hand, and then a fourth of the plate, the other fourth is the starchy foods, the carbs, the whole grains that are going to fill the fourth of the plate. It's a serving about the size of your fist that generally will provide an adequate amount of carbohydrate, but not too much to send the blood sugars too high. So I kind of think about it that way. You don't need to spend hours in the kitchen, but think about some of your favorite foods and maybe some quick and easy things that you or your family enjoy, and kind of start a list of those and recycle those. A lot of my patients tell me, yeah, the first week or two, it takes some thought, but after that, they get in the groove with it, and it becomes a lot easier. And, all of us have about 100 foods generally in what I call our food library that we typically will eat from day to day, week to week. So once you kind of get those ideas figured out, it definitely does get easier over time.
What about cooking for kids, children with diabetes? Or what kind of challenge does that present to parents?
Well, as I think back to when my son was young, some children can be picky. I had a very picky eater. He had a lot of texture and taste issues, so I know firsthand the challenges that can bring. But with children, you go back to the same basic principle as you think about with adults. How do we sneak vegetables in? And starting from an early age, what I've learned is if you can expose children to vegetables, they may not eat them the first time, and in general, for many of us, it takes 5 to 7 exposures to a vegetable to eat it, to where we're willing to try it and eat it, and people learn to like it. As I think about my own son and green beans, that was the thing he would not eat. But we kept putting a few on his plate, and over time, he learned to like those, and now it's one of his favorite vegetables. So I think with children, it's that exposing them to a variety of foods. They may not like it or try it the first time, but once they become familiar with it and see their family eating, those fruits, vegetables, or maybe fish or whatever the food would be, oftentimes they'll become more open to trying it and help broaden their food horizons. So we think about working in the fruits and vegetables, and of course with children, the dairy, whether that would be from milk or yogurt or cottage cheese, whatever it is that they'll eat in that regard.
Again, we're talking to Tami Ross, one of America's leading experts on diabetes. She's a registered dietitian and a certified diabetes educator. Tami, what about kind of a two-pronged question here? Is there a particular food or food group that most people probably erroneously think is absolutely okay to eat, diabetic or not? And then is there one that people think, no, there's no way you can eat that with diabetes, and yet, in fact, they can? Do you have an answer for that?
Okay, you may have to help me with the question to make sure I get the two parts right. When patients come and sit down across from me and we talk about what foods do you like and what have you been trying to work on and focus on, one of the questions I'll get, well, actually two questions I'll get frequently is, I know I can't eat any white foods. I hear that frequently. And, if you think about white foods, I think in general, people are referring to processed, bread products and that kind of stuff. But cauliflower is white, and bananas are white, and those are good for you. And milk is white. So that common myth out there that you can't eat anything white with diabetes, that is not true. And as I mentioned earlier, for listeners that may be joining, the real focus with diabetes is on carbohydrate consistency. So we focus on that a lot. And the message to my patients is that we can probably figure out how to fit in most any food that you want to eat. It may not be in the amount that you're used to. It may be a little bit different portion or less frequently, but even sweet treats can fit in. Years ago, people that may have had diabetes quite a while or, no family members that had it years ago, the message then was no concentrated sweets. And what research has shown over time is that, in fact, sweet treats can fit in. They just need to be factored into the carbohydrate control. So what I would tell folks is if you, have a little bit of a sweet tooth and are trying to manage blood glucose, that it's really about looking at the carbohydrate and the portion that you're eating and trying to keep that consistent from meal to meal. And just some general guidelines that I give my own patients and that often work for many people just as a starting point is for women 45 to 60 carbs a meal and for men 60 to 75. So people that may be listening, that kind of gives you a guideline of what to shoot for, and then you can talk with your diabetes educator or your healthcare team about what may be best for you. So that's a long answer. I hope I addressed your question in regard to foods.
What about and again, it may seem obvious, what about also the role of salt for those with diabetes?
That's a great question. As we think about salt, many processed foods and many fast foods are very rich in sodium. And the guideline for general good health and for people with diabetes as well is to try to hold the sodium at 2,300 milligrams daily or less. And, to give you a point of comparison, if you look at the sodium in some of the fast foods, a fast food meal could be that high or higher, more than what you should get in the whole day. Along with that, for people that may be struggling with high blood pressure or have other heart issues, the American Heart Association recommends an even lower sodium target of 1,500 milligrams a day. So I think for most of us, most Americans eat at least double the sodium that we need. And so for many probably that are listening, taking a peek at how much sodium you get a day and seeing where you fall, at least for that first goal of 2,300 a day or less.
Well, as we start to wind down here, what about give us some good news. What kind of snack, so to speak, or some healthy alternatives do you believe?
Snacks, that's a great question that I get quite often. So as we think about snacks, a few snacks on the go that can work. A hard-boiled egg is a really easy food to grab and take on the go. Some of my patients will cook 3 or 4 at a time and keep them in the refrigerator. Greek yogurt is another great snack, or string cheese and a few whole grain crackers. For people trying to work a vegetable serving in, a can of the reduced sodium tomato or vegetable type juice actually is a vegetable serving. A few other portable, easy ideas: a small apple or tangerine or a small banana. Guacamole actually is a good snack. 2 tablespoons with 6 or 7 baked tortilla chips. The guacamole has the monounsaturated fats, the good heart-healthy fats, and so that can be a really tasty snack. Another way to work in the heart-healthy fats without carbohydrate would be a small handful of almonds or walnuts or pistachios, the heart-healthy nuts that we hear so much about. And a couple of other ideas that people might think about in terms of fruit. Frozen grapes are good. With summer coming here shortly, a lot of my patients like those. You just stick a pot of grapes in the freezer, and they taste like sorbet or frozen sherbet when you go to eat those. So that gives you a lot of different ideas.
Well, the subject is one that is being studied now more than ever. It's approaching epidemic levels in the United States. That is diabetes, of course. We've been talking with one of America's experts, Tami A. Ross, highly recognized speaker and diabetic educator, and the brand new work called What Do I Eat Now? A Step-by-Step Guide to Eating Right with Type 2 Diabetes. It's the second edition. Tami, how can people find out more about the subject of diabetes and pick up a copy of the book?
Good question. So if listeners like what we've talked about today, they may want to check out the book, What Do I Eat Now? A Step-by-Step Guide to Eating Right with Type 2 Diabetes. It's published by the American Diabetes Association. And the website of the American Diabetes Association has lots of good, practical, understandable information about diabetes, and that would be diabetes.org. Pretty easy to remember. And for the book, it's available nationwide. You'll find it at shopdiabetes.org, as well as Amazon and in bookstores nationwide. So I hope that we have shared some good information with your listeners, made a difference in some people's lives today, and I've really enjoyed talking diabetes with you.
Well, I appreciate your time, appreciate the research and your attempts to spread the word about this condition. There's no question that it is a big health concern of many, many Americans. And best of luck to you, and like to have you on again sometime.
Thank you. Sure. Enjoy talking with you again.
We'll be back with more right after this.